listening to the Down the Wormhole podcast, exploring the strange and fascinating relationship between science and religion. This week, our hosts are
Rachel Jackson, Rabbi at Agudas Israel Congregation, Hendersonville, North Carolina. And the botanical feature I am most looking forward to seeing this coming year is split into two, because why answer one if I can have two? And the first is daffodils. I absolutely just love seeing the daffodils. And the second super political answer is sunflowers.
Ian Benz, Associate Professor of Elementary Science Education at UNC Charlotte. And it's hard for me to be specific when looking at things I'm looking forward to growing again, but what it always reminds me of when the trees start getting their leaves back and things start growing again is that it also means the return of birds and when they start really coming back and the building of nests. And we always have birds that build a nest right above our door, and we're able to watch them from the inside and then lay their eggs, and the chicks hatch and everything. And it's such a really cool experience. It's one of my favorite things that happen throughout every year. And so we've been seeing them slowly come back and start and we'll just sit there and watch them slowly build these nests, and then all of a sudden babies, and it's really fascinating. So that's what I'm looking forward to.
Zach Jackson, UCC pastor in Reading, Pennsylvania, and I am so excited for the return of my milkweed garden. I planted this a couple of years ago in this troublesome patch of my yard that I couldn't keep clear of weeds. And because milkweed is a weed, but it's a local weed, and the butterflies love it, I've been working to get it just really situated in there strongly. And at this point, I don't really have to do a whole lot of work. Every year they die, and then every year they come back double. And it's just really exciting. It's one of the first things that grows in my yard, and I always look forward to seeing life return after winter. But life doesn't always return. It doesn't always return that quickly either. There's been a lot of talk in recent years about being in the next major extinction event right now. There's a lot of talk about what humans are doing to the planet and the things that may or may not survive. I remember during the sort of global lockdown in 2020 from COVID, there was what some researchers were calling an anthropause, where people were all inside and there wasn't any business and there wasn't any commerce, and there was all these stories of dolphins, in the canals of Venice, which ended up not being true. Actually, most of these stories were not actually true about nature returning. But the meme that came up was nature is healing. I think my favorite one was a bunch of Crocs, the shoes, floating in the water, and it was Crocs are returning to their native habitat. Nature is healing.
I'm just sad that most of those stories weren't true.
Yeah, well, they were good stories, and so people didn't really want to hear from the fact checkers. They did give us a little bit of hope. I mean, you can look at the carbon levels all went down, but then when people went back to work, they doubled to make up for all of the lost income.
What was it, areas in China were able to... It
ended up being worse.
Yeah, areas in China were able to see mountains that they hadn't seen in a long time from their houses and stuff like that because of less smog and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, air pollution.
Yeah, nature kind of healed for a minute, and then we came back and nature paid the price again. But nature is resilient, and we're doing this series on healing. And so I wanted to think deeply about nature's ability to heal, about ecosystems' ability to heal. And what better time to look at with nature healing than one of the most cataclysmic events that has ever happened that we know of on the Earth, and that is the Cretaceous extinction event, the asteroid that famously killed the dinosaurs. And so I wanted to take a minute here at the beginning and give you kind of a minute-by-minute play-by-play, because I don't think we've really quite recognized the scope and the magnitude of this destruction. And I just think it's neat. So roughly 65-ish million years ago, give or take, there was this massive asteroid, larger than Mount Everest, and just so happened to be in the right place at the right time, or the wrong place at the wrong time, depending on who you are. And it crashed through the atmosphere into the Yucatan Peninsula, which by this point most folks know. I remember when I was a kid, nobody quite knew how the dinosaurs died out. There's even a scene in Jurassic Park where there's like the kid is like explaining all the different theories to Dr. Grant, and I watched that the other day and I thought, oh, doesn't everyone know it was an asteroid? But we didn't quite know that then. But satellite imagery and excavations, and we found this enormous crater down there that came from this asteroid that must have been the size of Mount Everest. And so in the instant of impact that it hits the ground, there is a flash of light. And that light is so hot that it incinerates every single thing within about 1,000-mile radius. 1,000 miles. And so anything 1,000 miles away from Mexico is just completely gone, incinerated. The hole that it creates is roughly 15 miles deep and 62 miles wide. So 15 miles deep is this hole. And all of the mantle, the earth, the crust, the rock, it all gets liquefied and sent outward and then back upward. The way that, if you imagine throwing a rock into a pool, the way that little like bit of water comes up. And so what happens is this temporary mountain of molten rock and mantle that's 6 miles high is formed right then and there. There are earthquakes around the world so massive that it triggered volcanic eruptions in what would later become India that lasted for 30,000 years and covered nearly the entire subcontinent in a lava flow. There was a shockwave that traveled about 600 miles per hour that leveled everything that wasn't instantly burned in all of North and South America. And as waters rushed back in, it caused tsunamis that blanketed all of the coastlines of the entire world, no matter where you were. If you were on the coastline, miles in, you were flooded and drowned. Good times, right? And this is all pretty quickly after the impact. So then, as that, you imagine throwing a rock into water and there's like a splash upward, that same sort of thing happens, except with all of the molten rock and everything gets thrown into the stratosphere and some into space itself, and then gets up there and orbits the Earth for a few minutes and then falls back down to Earth. All around the planet. So we're not just talking about Mexico anymore. This stuff has gone up there, it's circled the planet, and it is now bombarding the planet in every single area of the world. The kinetic energy carried by these little objects that we called spherules, because they were like round little balls. So the kinetic energy of those things falling back to Earth is about 20 million megatons. So if I can put that into perspective, it would be like dropping a 1 megaton hydrogen bomb in 4-mile intervals around the entire world. So that's like 10 Hiroshimas every 4 miles across the entire world is how much energy was in those little balls of rock falling back down to the Earth. And that would have incinerated just about everything. There's a 2022 paper published in Nature that looked at the fossils of sturgeon and paddlefish in North Dakota in this destructive layer that we find around the world from all of this falling down of awful debris. And it found those little spherules in the gills of fossilized fish. So if they're in the gills, then we can pretty safely say that those fish died during that event because, the world would have then been blanketed by ash, and so they would have been buried. So the fact that they were in the gills tells us that they died because of this. And those fish's bones are kind of like tree rings where you can see little seasons of growth. And so by looking at those fossils in North Dakota, we were able to figure out that the impact was likely in late spring, early summer. And the angle of that impact also suggests an early morning collision. So let's say all of this happened May 20th, about 9 a.m., just to help give you some details into that. So all of that falling debris heated up the atmosphere to hundreds of degrees for a few minutes. There are some scientists who say it could have gotten as high as 1,000 degrees in the air. So even if you're not hit by something, the air itself is the temperature of an industrial oven for at least a couple of minutes. And this is all happening within about an hour of impact. And then it sparked fires across the world. And so all of those beautiful trees, all those new flowers and vegetables and fruits and beautiful new trees that had been evolving over the eons just laid to waste. Those fires would have burned for months and months and months, killing every single thing, essentially, that was not initially wiped out by the explosion, by the falling debris, by the 1,000-degree temperature in the air, and then blocking out the sun with all of the smoke. And so after that 1,000 degrees, within a few days, there's no sunlight anymore. And the temperature drops by dozens and dozens of degrees, and suddenly it's cold. There's ice on the ground. What used to be a worldwide jungle suddenly became an ice planet. And so we think of the dinosaurs dying slowly over time, but probably, generally speaking, most species would have become extinct in a matter of minutes or hours after that impact. This would have been immediate and devastating and dramatic, and there should not have been anything that survived. Right? Because if even if you survived that initial explosion, the fires, the air temperatures, and then that immediate drop in temperature and the blacking out of the sun, I mean, that should destroy the entire food web. I mean, 80%, 90% of plankton died because there's no sun. And without the plankton, which provides the backbone of the food web in the sea, we lost all the ammonites and the large marine reptiles and crashed the entire marine food web. We still have horseshoe crabs, those awful northeastern creatures that have survived every single extinction event. God bless them. The bottom feeders with their magical blue blood. I feel like we've talked about them before. They look like if you combined a demon with a catcher's mitt, and they have survived all of these years. But very few things did. I mean, 80% of all animal species died out forever in that probably just within a month or two, gone completely. The world reduced to ash, to a cold and awful and dead winter. So what survives? And how does the world rebound? How do we come back from that? Well, probably within about a year or so, the sun started to peek back through the clouds. And there's all of these species that are pretty good at hibernating or surviving off of very little. You think of in times of food scarcity, alligators can just kind of go to sleep. A lot of little mammals can survive on just little things and live underground. And if they were so lucky to have been in their burrow when the impact happened, then they could have been saved from the worst effects of it and emerged into this world and hibernated for some time until the sun returned. And when the sun returned, there was nothing green left on the planet. But there's this miraculous thing called a fern that has survived for millions and millions of years because it is so resilient, because it doesn't need seeds to grow. It sends out spores like a fungus, and those spores can go into the soil and can lay dormant in the soil for decades. And then once it gets turned over and there's some sunlight and some warmth and some water, it can grow. And so right above the layer, this global layer that we have of destruction, there is another layer of just an obscene amount of ferns. It's like the world went from being a global jungle to a global fern field. I don't know what you would call that. I like fern field.
It's good. That's good alliteration.
Yeah.
Trademark it, fern field. There's a lot of new studies being done right now on what makes ferns so resilient, with the hopes of being able to take some of that genetic information and splice it into things like corn and wheat to help with our food supply globally, because we're kind of doing similar things to our environment right now. And nothing as instantly catastrophic as a meteor the size of Mount Everest, but what maybe happened in an hour or two 65 million years ago could feasibly happen within a couple of 100 years, thanks to human intervention in the Anthropocene. So we can thank ferns for the fact that humans took over the planet. So if you have ferns in your yard, or if you see a fern on the side of the road, just take a minute and give it a little high five and thank it. Say, thanks, fern. You're the reason why my tiny mouse-like ancestors survived. And then after you started growing, provided food and shelter and water for them, and nurtured the world back from almost total collapse into the beautiful and vibrant thing that we have today. And we're sorry for destroying the world again, but we trust that you'll have it taken care of. And you'll survive this, and you'll help the next species to take over the world. So thanks, ferns.
I like that. When we all die off, ferns will still be here to save what's left. Yeah.
I mean, I don't think that's unrealistic. I'm not super optimistic about the fate of humanity in general. I don't think we will survive for, until the heat death of the universe or anything like that. We'll become extinct just like the dinosaurs went extinct, and there will be another life form. Maybe one will gain consciousness like us, maybe not. Maybe the universe doesn't need consciousness. Maybe consciousness is a little too chaotic for long-term survival. But either way, the ferns will probably be here, and the ferns will probably help nature heal. And I kind of love that. I kind of love ferns.
Do you have ferns?
My backyard used to be full of them when we first moved in.
What did you do with those ferns?
A huge tree back there. Oh, I murdered them ruthlessly.
I thought you liked ferns.
I pulled up all their root systems. I didn't know. It was years ago, and I didn't understand the value and beauty of ferns, and so I repent.
Do you think they'll forget?
No, ferns never forget. They are known for their vindictiveness.
Creepy turn.
Yes. Revenge is a dish best served with fronds, as we say.
And as we'll hear later on, everything is connected, so you need to be careful, Zach. Okay? All things are connected in some way.
That's true. We will talk about that later in the Down the Wormhole Minute. And I actually do want to think a little bit about not only the precarious nature of life and the stubborn nature of life in general. I should say, I want to think more deeply about the precarious nature of individual species and individual lives, but the almost ruthless tenacity of life in general, and how not only do we live within that as humans, as good people, but how can we also affirm any kind of good, overseeing, theistic God in the midst of a system of life that is just so brutal? So we'll talk about that in a minute. So then, let's break it down into two questions then. First of all, what is your general feeling about the resiliency of life on Earth? Are you feeling a little hopeless right now at the future of human life, of the Anthropocene in general? Are you feeling optimistic? Are there things that are being developed that give you hope? Or have you just, you buying land in Kentucky because it'll be beachfront soon?
Well, I think there was more than two questions, or more than a single
yes.
single question. No, in the sense that your very first question was, hope about life, and then you went to the human and all of our destructive patterns that we have towards nature, and these last specifically couple thousand years at best. So I'll answer the first, and that is, I believe that since the Precambrian explosion, plus or minus 500 million years ago, give or take a million years or something.
Plus or minus 500 million
You don't get
years.
to say that often, when that happened, there's no going back. The difference between 0 and 1 is infinite. And I think once we hit 1, there's no going back to 0. What's in between, though, or what's beyond that, I don't know. I don't think that life on Earth will ever cease, barring some external catastrophe, like a bombardment of asteroids, right? Not just a singular asteroid, because we've seen that we survived that. So a bombardment of massive asteroids, which I don't have a working crystal ball at the moment, so I can't say it. But, outside of something along those lines, I think life will exist on Earth, and I think life will thrive on Earth, not just simply exist. There'll be moments of regeneration and renewal and demise, but overall, I have no negativity or pessimism to that piece. I also have very little, I'm very ambivalent toward the existence of humanity as a whole. I kind of don't care if we survive. I kind of think it would be okay if we didn't.
I was not expecting that answer.
Yeah. I feel like you're channeling Adam right now.
Just more of a geological understanding of time, in the sense that if we really truly look at the longevity of creatures as a whole, they're not that long. And we frankly lump dinosaurs, 165 million years of dinosaurs into one category, but there's a reason that the Stegosaurus and the Tyrannosaurus didn't exist at the same time, right? That they were massive extinctions of huge creatures throughout all of those periods, but we can't understand 100 million years and 150 million years in any reasonable way. So we just dinosaurs, right?
Well, hold on there. Wait a minute now. According to Jurassic Park, they did exist at the same time.
Weird that a movie got a fact wrong.
They existed in 1993 together.
Right.
Exactly.
But
yeah. So my apologies to Steven Spielberg.
But we are closer to the T-Rex than the T-Rex was to the Stegosaurus.
That's right. But we lump them all together, so we forget that extinctions happen all the time, and there's nothing wrong with it. And the extinctions happen, species upon species, and they're not so long lived. 1 million years, 2 million maybe. And if we take a look at the human side, when do we decide how old we are? Are we 6 million years old? Right? Is it when we first barely started separating from our primate ancestors? And do we look back to Lucy, 3-ish million years ago? Do we just look at the Homo species, right? Homo erectus, Homo sapiens, etc., Homo neanderthals. Do we look at just the Homo sapiens of the last 50,000 years? And even if we only look at those ones that we'd say, okay, could they possibly breed together and have non-sterile offspring? Yeah, we're really only looking at a couple million years. So I'd say if we have another million years, we're doing good as a species on this planet. And I have no issues with that. I have major issues with 2022 and how the future is going to look from a personal standpoint. From a, what world am I leaving my grandchildren, my great-grandchildren? What world are they going to have to survive in? And that's where I'm not ambivalent, but really very pessimistic. And that's what's hard. And that's where this change comes from. So total optimism when it comes to Earth, ambivalence when it comes to humanity, and pessimism when it comes to 21st century humanness, and sadness when it comes to the very real personal. So that's my long answer.
Yeah, I can agree with that, especially when you look at, all of the environmental destruction that's caused by humans for such a long time, that I do worry about that with my children and grandchildren and just later generations, right? And how it seems like, at least, I wouldn't argue this for every culture, every human culture right now, but at least the U.S. culture, if maybe Western culture, does seem to be focused more on the immediate and not thinking, at least the narrative that I seem to pick up on is not thinking about the long-term ramifications of our decisions on our future generations. That just does not seem to be talked about as much, or at least I don't hear it. And that always worries me. It's more of a financially, right? Making sure that our next generation is financially stable, but not looking at financially as in monetarily, right? Not just...
Well, on that note, it is March 18th right now. This episode probably will not be released for another month, so the thing I'm about to say might be totally moot if there's, nuclear war or something like that.
Which is not an impossibility.
No, every day feels like we might be a little closer to global thermonuclear war. But right now, we don't. Right now, the entire world has very strongly sanctioned Russia, and their economic system is falling apart. And the price of gas is gone crazy, despite the fact that Russia provides basically none of our gas. We're still hugely affected by the instability of the world. The instability of the world that comes on the tails of 2 years of a global pandemic. And one of the things that is coming out of this right now is a lot of money is being put into alternative energy sources. And Europe's been doing this for some time now, but we're starting to see more investment in the U.S. And this always happens when gas prices go up. When it becomes harder to pay for this sort of thing, then there's financial incentive to increase renewable energy sources. And I was just reading about some really interesting carbon capture technology as well. The problem with a lot of carbon capture technology, where they take carbon out of the atmosphere and then they convert it into something, is then they want to use it as fuel to provide a financial incentive, basically. And so they'll take carbon out of the atmosphere, turn it into pellets, and then give it to you to burn, which sends it right back up. But there is some really interesting stuff now being done in which that carbon is taken out and put back into the earth, which could potentially save us from a climate catastrophe, in addition to all the other catastrophes that we're having. There is some really interesting breakthroughs with nuclear power. The newer nuclear power plants can run off of the spent fuel of previous generations of nuclear power plants. And so if we were to build more nuclear plants now with the modern machinery inside, we don't even need to enrich more uranium. We can just use the stuff that's locked away in the salt mines right now. And we could be greening the earth once again. there is just more of a financial incentive right now to do that because of the global instability than there was a couple of years ago. And so there is a little bit of hope on the horizon that maybe we'll get some sense knocked into us before it's too late, and the ferns have to save us. But I'm not super optimistic either about the collective intelligence of humankind.
Yeah, at times. Yeah, I feel that way too, especially when it comes to when I talk about what it means to make sure that we're caring for our future generations. The fact that it still always seems to be that many focus more selfishly on their own future generations, not others.
So it's almost like you need to trick the wealthy and powerful into making decisions that would benefit the masses by making them think that it would just benefit themselves.
It actually reminds me of a conversation we had, with the friends of yours when we did the series on race and racism. And
yeah, the color correction podcast.
Yes, with the color correction crew. And we were talking about, something similar when we're talking about racism and white people focusing on it and we talked about, I think climate change came up, right? We were talking about environmental racism. That's right. And how it was
yes.
How the way that it seems that the rich and powerful, and white population especially are trying to, for them to get to pay attention is how does it directly impact them? Because, especially with like climate change, for example, you hear all of these concerns about future island nations eventually being wiped off the face of the earth because of sea level rise. And many people you'll hear the argument, well, that's not going to impact me. So why should I care about it? Right. And so it's that whole mentality of, well, it has to impact me to care. It's always bugged me. And I know we brought it up during that conversation too. And I think Bethany pointed out the problem with that argument is that it shouldn't be that way. It should just be that we actually care about others. I remember Bethany saying that.
Yeah. Yeah, the government of the Solomon Islands is currently trying to purchase a large swath of land in mainland Asia to resettle their entire population because the Solomon Islands are going to be the first nation to be completely obliterated by sea level rise. And that's already happening.
Wow.
And so they're trying to get ahead of it to move an entire nation and create a new one because theirs is going to not exist. So the ferns won't be able to save that. So I'll change gears here with the final segment. So we are currently screwing up our ecosystem, and there's not a whole lot of debate. Even for those people who are like diehard climate change is a hoax, even those people can't help but look at the world and be like, wow, we've also messed up other things like wetlands and all of that, right? I mean, everyone can agree to some way, shape, and form that we are doing bad things to the environment. But the environment had bad things happening to it for eons before we showed up. And I mean, the asteroid is one example. The volcanic activity in other times. There are probably other collisions. There have been global climate change experiences. We used to just be a ball of ice, and then we were a ball of fire, and there was a global forest. And like the Earth has existed for billions of years in very different ways. And life, as we have it today, only exists because 99.99% of all species have gone extinct. Without those species going away, we would not have had the niche that we needed to thrive and take over the world. So we are only here asking these questions because the world is brutal and creates by destruction.
Oh, I love that. Creates by destruction. That's intense.
Yeah.
That's intense.
So I feel like, and your theologies may differ, but we so often preach this like loving shepherd who is like shepherding the cosmos, who creates things intentionally and then guides them into their fullest selves and their fruition. And that image of a benevolent creator God is hard to reconcile with the fossil record. And I'm wondering if either of you have ever spent any time thinking about that.
Totally. Kind of mean that seriously. Yeah, I absolutely have. Oh gosh, where do I go? I love the beginning of Genesis, right? Of Bereshit. And that phrase, tohu vavohu, which can be translated in so many ways. Robert Alter translates it as welter and waste, which is a great idea. If that's the natural, and to me, so to carry on for those that aren't intimately familiar with these verses, right? From tohu vavohu, now you both are, from this welter and waste comes creation. And I just love that idea that our natural state is chaotic. And so it's actually our challenge. It's our issue. It's our mishigas, our sort of craziness that is needing this sense of control. The world doesn't. Right? And if the point of Scripture and perhaps our view of Scripture and how it creates a relationship between a divine and the human is to have a relationship, then this divine partnership is giving us a job. And that if the world in and of its base state is chaotic, and our job, so that we have one to be in relationship with divine, is to imbue control, then that's kind of seems like an us problem, not a God problem and not a world problem. So yes, that's what I have thought about. Okay. What other thoughts did I had other thoughts? Can you say your question again before you stop cutting this part?
Yeah, it was just
because you phrased it
basically. How do we reconcile a creation that grows by violence and destruction with a good God who cares about God's creation? Because I wonder, it was easier to say that back before we knew that extinction was even possible, right? I mean, the knowledge of extinction is still a pretty recent concept. Even reaching back a couple hundred years ago, people could never imagine that you could completely obliterate a species off the planet. You think about when they would find dinosaur fossils, they just imagined that they were dragons and other mythical creatures. But now we know, and we've done it. We've seen it. The poor dodo bird and the Tasmanian tiger and the white-horned rhino. Is that one gone now? I don't know.
Think so.
We're killing rhinos off pretty fast. Yeah.
Maybe by the time the episode airs. Sorry, that was a little morbid.
So chipper. But now we know, and now we know how fragile life is and how common extinction is. And so back then, when we thought that the creatures that exist are the creatures that have existed, and that we can come up with these mythologies of God creating the frogs and the crocodiles and the fish and the baboons and not have to think about all of their evolutionary predecessors. It was easy to say, God created all the things that God wanted, and they were good and wonderful and loving, and God wants all of them to thrive in their own separate ecosystems. But now we know better. And if we were to be writing a new creation myth today, given what we know, we would not create the same creation myth. We would not write a story of a God who speaks all things into existence from nothing. We would probably speak... If I'm imagining a new creation myth that I'm writing today, knowing what we know, I might imagine God speaking a spark. God creates a spark in the midst of all of the kindling of the world. And the spark grows into a flame, which grows into an inferno, which grows, right? Like some kind of image of something, God speaking something small, which becomes something big over time, instead of God speaking all the things right away, all prepackaged.
Well, don't you think, I mean, if we were able to, what am I trying to say? So I'm hearing lots of different creation myths in my own head. Starting from Genesis, and again, being very biased in where that's coming from my lens of Judaism and from the lens that it sprouted from. So if we go to the Gilgamesh narrative, right, which is pre-Christianity, pre-Judaism, but still post-civilization, right, that we've already planted things, we've already have wheat growing, we already have cities, we're not just people sustaining ourselves like other animals, but that we really have cultures in those other ways. Right. So if we look at the myth of Gilgamesh, and the destructive nature, right? That God destroyed the world with a flood, and that happens a lot, or whatever God was existing in Gilgamesh. And we took that into the Noah narrative, which many of our religions use. And I see the Noah narrative as we all rely on one another. So that's part one, that it's not we're using this, that it's not a using of, but it's an appreciation of and a need for everything. That's why it says take, either 2 or 4 or 49 or 14. Depends how you understand the phrases and which ones you're... 2 by 2. Does 2 by 2 mean 2? Does it mean 4? Because it's 2 times 2? And then there's another verse that says 7 of 7. So is that 14 or is that 49? So either way, a bunch of every creature. That means there has to be a value and a respect and a need for every creature. So I see really a positive in that. The other piece that I'd like to say in this, rather than, snap your fingers, God snaps God's fingers and poof, there it is, which doesn't go with our understanding, is if we really look at the 6 days of creation as an evolutionary understanding, right? That each of these different days is an evolutionary moment of our world. Humans didn't show up at the Precambrian explosion, right, at all. Something else had to come first. And if we read it, we have to take the chaos, the volcanic eruptions, and calm those down first. And then we get green stuff. Fantastic. Now that we have green stuff, maybe we can get a few creepy crawlies. And once we get creepy crawlies, we can get things that eat the creepy crawlies, and on until you get to us. So rather than us, hey, we're the best, we're the biggest, we're the last. We were the hardest to formulate, to evolve. And I see it as an evolution rather than magic happened. It didn't detail it because it's not a scientific book. But there is recognition that it doesn't just happen, that there's a process, and that there's change that needs to happen, that we humans are not the same, and these creatures aren't the same either. And I think there is that recognition in other cultures that we see. And it's really this idea that I'm, this domineering, we're in control. I wonder how much of that is kind of just modernity in us taking advantage of the world around us in the way that we've taken advantage of other human beings, and saying, oh, if I can control a human being, how much the more so I can control the world in which we live. So I do wonder.
I love creation stories. They say so much about the culture that thought them up, right? The Babylonian creation story is the gods create humans as slaves to do their work for them. And there's a great war between the gods, and the humans have to fight. And there's a part in the myth where the people are too noisy, and so the god hates them and kills most of them. That same trope comes up in Greek creation myths, where Prometheus creates people, and Zeus is like, these people suck, and I'm going to kill them all. And Prometheus is like, no, don't do it. I'm going to save a guy and on a boat. There's always boats. Lots of boats and floods. People live by water. Right. Floods happen. Yep. But like those two creation stories and lots of other ones they're based around violence and war. There's conflict in the world. Those are domineering societies. They have conflict as the main part of their narrative. The Lenape creation story, which is the indigenous peoples who live up here in the Northeast, there was a great spirit who existed in a realm of nothingness, and that great spirit fell asleep and had a dream, and dreamed of this beautiful world with its green and its growing things, and woke up and decided to make that dream a reality, and so created 4 helper spirits, the grandfathers of the North, West, and East, and the grandmother of the South. And together with the Great Spirit and the grandparents, they created soil, they created a great tree, and from the roots of that tree grew humans and grew other creatures. And so there's a dreaming and a creating and things emerging from the dirt, which is very much in line with the way that the Lenape see their relationship with the soil, that everything comes from the soil, returns to the soil. There's not an element of conquest and war and domineering in that. I think that the story in Genesis is beautiful because it shows a God who is intimately connected with creation.
Yeah, and
every day.
Yeah, I just want to add the Hebrew piece there to the human, right? So that the name of the first human, again, I don't take it literally, but I just want to, I don't believe this was the first human, but the first human to exist in this particular set of scripture was Adam, or if we give it the Hebrew, Adam. And Adam was formed from the earth, and was then, the punishment was to till the earth till sweat came off of his nose. And earth in these words is Adamah. It's the same root, that we are of the earth, right? That we are not just kind of connection, but Adam from Adamah. Like, it's just, this is who we are. Again, if we look strictly at the creation story, not what we've done to it.
Yeah. And God, in that story, God creates just because.
Right.
There's never a reason given. God just decides to and doesn't need to form things, just speaks it into existence, and then wants to take a day off to just hang out with us. And you don't see that kind of that. I think that speaks a lot to the people who wrote it and the people who cling to it.
Right, and let's also further define what this Sabbath is, what Shabbat is. Shabbat is not strictly an abstaining from creation. The Sabbath is abstaining from creating or destroying. And I think that extra piece is not necessarily known. And so in religious Jewish circles, I shouldn't put it that way, in halakhically rigorous circles, in Jewish law, oh, wow, that's a complicated sentence.
Thank you for the clarifying.
Yeah. What happens is on the Sabbath, one example is, we go to the bathroom. We're not going to stop going to the bathroom, but usually we have a roll of toilet paper in the bathroom. And then when you take off however many pieces that you're using, right? Any kids out there, it really should be about 4. Please stop using 20 or 30 every time. Just saying. Not that that's been an issue in my household. So, but you have to tear the toilet paper off the roll. And in, let's just say, Orthodox households, they have pre-torn toilet paper so that there's no destruction whatsoever. Scissors are put away. There is neither creation nor destruction that happens on the Sabbath. And I find that to be utterly beautiful, that we just appreciate what is as it is, not for what we wish it to be or for what we wish it weren't, but really just is. And we can use that a lot more in our wider society, I believe.
So in our final minutes, do you want to take a stab at writing a new creation?
Well, I'll go with a translation of Genesis in a beginning. I don't believe that there is such thing as the beginning. So that's where I would start, is in a beginning. Where would you go from there?
I didn't have one in mind when I said that. But so a creation myth helps to explain the how, a little bit, the how of creation, but more than that, the why of creation. And so I think what I'm imagining is, in the beginning, God began unfolding. What do you unfold? Paper.
Petals. Flower, like an unfurling, right? Just a blossoming of.
Yeah. In the beginning, God created a flower and invited that flower to open its petals. And as he did, those petals opened and sprouted other flowers, which then God invited to open those flowers. And God then was present with each and every flower as they grew exponentially, which grew from 1 flower to 2 flowers to 4 flowers to 8 flowers to 16 flowers and 32 flowers and so on and so forth. And as God was with each and every flower, saw that it was good, that some flowers became blue, because blue had not existed, and blue was beautiful in a way that those red flowers were not. And then as those blue flowers grew, God saw that it was good that some of those flowers began sprouting 2 heads, because the previous flowers had 1 head, and that was good, but this is also good in a different way. And as God stayed with the 2-headed blue flowers, God saw that it was good that this plant stopped having flowers and grew mostly underground. And God saw that and said, wow, the other ones were above ground and outwardly beautiful, but this one's beauty comes from its function less than its form, and that too is good. And then God existed with each and every one until the universe was filled with endless diversity and beauty, and God was present and reveling and loving each and every plant that grew across the wide expanse of forever, enjoying and loving and celebrating each individual difference, recognizing its goodness and its fragility. I don't know. There's my stab.
Subparagraph, part 2. Go back to, I love how you pictured red flowers. I was picturing yellow. I love it. So we've got all of these one-headed, unfurled, blossomed red flowers, and then creates a blue one and loves that difference. And the blue one looks over at the red one and says, I love you. And the blue and the red one partner, and they say, how beautiful is this newness that we ourselves created, that we are also part of this, and we can create beauty. And from them came a yellow one-headed flower, and the yellow one-headed flower looked at the blue two-headed flower that had erupted and said, wow, aren't you beautiful? And next thing we know, we have green flowers, and they're underground and above ground, and then they become thick and they become trees, and on until the universe is populated not just by what is good and beautiful, but by the relationships that see the beauty in each other.
Yeah, that's good. I think my emphasis is on the fact that the flowers co-create. That needs to be there.
Yeah.
That it's not just God saying, all right, I'm tired of blue, now here's a purple.
Yeah.
I'm tired of purple, here's a yellow. But it's that the purple and the yellow come together and they create green somehow.
Yeah.
And that's a mystery.
Spotted and speckled.
And all the while, God is like, hell yeah, that's awesome. And then the flowers are invited to also look at the other flowers in the way that God sees them. And those flowers that refuse to,
well, they just shrivel and die.
Refuse to see, they themselves cut themselves off from the redemptive life.
Right.
And though they may cause some death in their nearby flowers, they themselves are cut off from the source and wither and die into nothingness.
Love it. Let's do it. Let's write it.
All right, I'm into it. Let's start a new religion.
There.
What would we call our religion,
man.
by the way?
I don't know. All right, if anyone at home knows, tell us. We need seeds. Pun intended.
Leave it on our Facebook page or in the Down the Wormhole Conversations group what we should name our new religion that is based on cosmic flowers. And now, on a completely separate note, off to Ian.
Okay. All right. So, yeah, I'll just talk real quick. So, for my Down the Wormhole Minute, I really want to talk about the book titled Everything is Spiritual by Rob Bell, which is also the new tour, or the tour he's been doing since the fall. It's actually the third time he's done a tour called Everything is Spiritual. And I had the opportunity to go down to a talk several weeks ago, so the end of February, to Dallas to hang out with my buddy Mark, and he and I went to the talk, and it was a really cool experience. But I just wanted to say a few things about this because it's really this particular book. I've read several of Rob's books, but this particular one really kind of struck me, and so there's just some neat quotes in here that I wanted to talk about, and also to kind of I felt like it reminded me of why I want to write the book that I need to get back to. Because he talks a lot in there about the role of curiosity and awe and wonder, stuff I want to focus on, asking questions, doubting. And so this book, I was going to read a little bit real quick description from the cover. I've had a sense since I was young that there's more going on here, that the world is not a cold, dead place, that it's alive in some compelling and mysterious way. This book is about that sense. And then kind of goes on, I'm not going to read the whole cover description, but kind of goes on this idea of what types of questions he likes to ask. And so in this, it's not just hey, here's things I'm curious about, but it's a little bit of a memoir, and how he ended up losing, what led to him leaving the church that he started in Michigan. And the one that he was kind of kicked out of by his own people. After the writing of the book, Love Wins. That's correct, right, Zach? It was after that book is what kind of...
Oh, yeah. He was mid-tour when that book came out, and the venue he was supposed to speak at the next day that had thousands of seats sold, there were only like a dozen people there. The backlash was instant and...
Wow, I didn't realize that part. I forgot that.
Seething.
Yeah.
Oh, my gosh. He just went from a superstar in the evangelical world to a total pariah overnight.
Interesting. So in this book, he kind of gets into that. But one of the things I really loved about in this particular book is him constantly going into a conversation around the importance of questions and the type of questions that he finds fascinating, that I also find fascinating. And his argument, what he was saying is that the why questions of why something is happening were not nearly as interesting to him as the what question. The what happened after this, what happened after that, what those losses led to that someone was experiencing. So the what questions were fascinating for him. I still am fascinated by why questions, but I was still just more of, this is really cool that you have someone who is really kind of laying it out there about who he is and what matters to him. He constantly talks about the whole point of curiosity, stating things like curiosity is underrated. There's a humility baked into curiosity. Curiosity is an antidote to despair. He goes through in here and talks some about the questioning God, which, I think I've said on the show some, but I've definitely said in conversations with you all that when I've gotten pushback from random people online about me wanting to ask about questions I would have for God or just questions I have about religion, that some people will defend God, and my response is always, I think God can handle my questions. I don't really care if you can. And so I think, and I know that Zach, I've talked about this with many of the different things I've done with that Rob Bell promotes in some of his work, is that how I think one time I referred to him as having it. And I forgot what your response to me, Zach, was, but he's something like he wouldn't say he had it. But it was just that how he has become such an inspiration for me and a drive, but also to help me remember, too, that on this my own journey and my religious and spiritual journey and the things I want to learn more about, that one thing I continue to work on is learning that I don't need to rely so much on the support of others in order to be successful. Like I can make decisions for myself type thing, right? That I still value the input from friends and family and colleagues about making decisions, but I know that I am someone who will sometimes delay a decision simply because I'm looking for that affirmation to know it's okay to make that decision, if that makes sense. So case in point, Rachel, last time we saw each other, I was talking about two options I had for positions I was potentially pursuing that I would be elected to leadership-wise. And the week after that, I made the decision to run for neither. That third option emerged in my brain of just, hey, I don't need to do either of these things. I could focus on the book. I could do more stuff with our science and religion work and all of that kind of stuff. And my dean was the one, after I thought about it, met with him, I said, this is kind of where I'm going. He said, I think you need to go with option 3. It's time for you to be selfish. And he said, and focus on the work that matters to you, and then focus on your family. He said, and make sure you use those things to elevate yourself. And so, which was really nice. And he said, the other options are things you can explore later on in your career. But what that gets back to, though, is that I kind of knew in my heart before he and I talked almost 2 weeks ago that I needed to not run for either of those options. I needed to be selfish. But at the same time, too, I was looking for that affirmation from a leader, right? From a superior, which is something I am continuously working on, like still wanting to work with my superiors, but knowing that I can make the decision on my own. And so he has this great quote in here that I really like a lot, because this is the fear I have when it comes to writing the book I want to write is, Rob, in this book, he says, we can't control the outcomes of our work. We don't get to decide how people will respond to us. An astonishing amount of the effect of our efforts is out of our hands, which is something that I still kind of find it ironic that I needed to be told that, to be reminded of the fact that, I don't need to necessarily always have to focus on others, if that makes sense, to make my own decisions. So, I could keep rambling. I know I am. It's a book I recommend to people if they're at all interested in spirituality. And one thing I over the past years with my students and my methods courses especially, is I've really tried, because I so highly value the connection that I develop with all of my students, and that for a year and a half I wasn't able to do that face to face because we were fully virtual, and how I was so worried about it that I then learned that I could still do it, and students would talk about that even in course evaluations. And so it's something that I've really embraced with my own instruction about the importance of teaching, is that it's better to connect with people, and that when you are able to develop that connection with your students, that you can teach them anything. And I always tell my students that they need to know that you value them as a person more than just you're teaching them something like content wise. And what's fascinating is that while I was reading this book, Everything is Spiritual, he keeps talking the idea is that everything is connected. And so that was just something that I really kind of took to. So yeah, that's my rambling.
Well, thank you.
I love you guys.
Love you too again.
Yo, keep that in. I heard it, Zach. I heard it.
I'm not ashamed of my love.
Anyway, it was a really cool book. So
Great job. Great job.